Imagine waking up at 4 in the morning to the deafening sound of bronze trumpets echoing through the camp. Your hands are bleeding from the blisters you formed yesterday during training. Your stomach is empty because your last meal was a piece of stale bread and a few olives. Around you, thousands of men move like a perfectly oiled machine, knowing that any hesitation, any moment of weakness, could mean the difference between life and death. This isn't a Hollywood movie. This is the brutal reality of the Roman legion, the most feared military force in ancient history. And you, my friend, wouldn't last 24 hours in this organized hell. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, hit that subscribe button right now, because the content you're about to discover will completely change your perspective on what it means to be truly resilient. And tell me in the comments, what time is it in your city while you're watching this video? I want to know if you're one of those late-night watchers or taking advantage of lunch to learn about one of the most efficient war machines that ever existed. The Roman legion wasn't just an army, it was an institution that transformed ordinary men into instruments of imperial conquest for over 1,000 years. From the early days of the Republic until the fall of the Western Roman Empire, the legions were the pillar upon which the greatest empire the Western world had ever known was built. But the price of this efficiency was so high that most modern people simply couldn't afford it. Let's start with recruitment. Do you think joining the legion was like enlisting in the modern army? Forget everything you know. First, you had to be a Roman citizen, which already eliminated millions of people in the empire. Second, you had to be between 17 and 46 years old. Third, and this is the detail you know, you had to be at least 5 feet 7 inches tall. That may not seem like much today, but back then, when the average height was much shorter due to poor nutrition, this requirement eliminated a significant portion of the candidates. But the physical requirements were only the beginning. Roman recruiters had specific methods to test not only your strength, but also your mental toughness. They made you carry heavy equipment for long distances, not to see if you could handle it, but to observe how you reacted when you began to fail. They wanted men who would keep marching even when their bodies screamed for them to stop. Basic training lasted for intense months, for months that would completely transform your perception of human limits. You woke before dawn and went to sleep long after sunset. Each day began with a 10-kilometer run in full gear. Not a jog in the park, but a military run carrying over 20 kilos of equipment, including your armor, shield, spear, sword, and provisions. After the morning run came combat training. But the Romans didn't mess around. They created a training system so realistic that many recruits died during the exercises. You trained with wooden swords that were purposely heavier than real ones, so that when you finally wielded a real gladius, it would feel light as a feather. You practiced striking wooden posts for hours, until your hands bled and your muscles trembled with exhaustion. The Roman shield, known as a scutum, weighed about 10 kilograms. 10 kilograms that you had to carry and maneuver as if it were an extension of your own body. Instructors made you practice combat formations for hours, moving the shield in perfect synchronization with hundreds of other soldiers. One wrong move, a second's hesitation, and you'd get a blow from the instructor that would leave scars for weeks. But perhaps the most brutal aspect of training was the discipline. Roman discipline was so rigorous that it made the most rigid modern military seem like Boy Scouts at summer camp. If you were late for a formation, you were publicly flogged. If you lost a piece of equipment, you paid for its replacement out of your own pocket. And since soldiers were paid very little, this meant weeks or even months of lost pay. If you questioned an order, even an obviously stupid one, you faced punishments ranging from forced labor to summary execution. The Romans had a concept called decimation, where if an entire unit failed in battle or demonstrated cowardice, 1 in 10 soldiers was executed by their own comrades. Imagine the psychological pressure of knowing that your survival depended not only on your own performance, but on the performance of every man beside you. Food was another challenge that most modern people would be unable to handle. The Roman soldier received a daily ration consisting primarily of wheat, which he had to grind himself and make into a kind of porridge or stale bread. Occasionally, there was meat, usually salt pork or sausage, but the diet was monotonous and nutritionally limited. You ate the same thing day after day, month after month, year after year. And don't be fooled into thinking you could simply buy better food with your pay. Soldiers earned so little that most of their pay went toward equipment, additional food, and various fees the Army levied. Many soldiers ended their 25 years of service poorer than when they started. The equipment you carried weighed between 50 and 30 pounds. This included your metal armor, which alone weighed about 30 pounds, your 10-pound shield, your sword, spear, javelins, camp building tools, cooking utensils, extra clothing, and several days' worth of provisions. All of this was on your back as you marched between 20 and 40 kilometers a day. The Roman march was an art in itself. It wasn't simply walking from one point to another. It was a coordinated and synchronized movement of thousands of men who had to reach their destination in battle formation, ready to fight. The pace was relentless. If you fell behind, you were abandoned. If you fell, you were left where you were. The Legion didn't stop for individuals. During the march, you not only carried your own equipment, but also shared responsibility for the collective equipment. Each group of 8 soldiers, called a contubernium, shared a tent, cooking equipment, construction tools, and a mule to carry the heavier items. But if the mule died or was lost, guess who would carry the extra weight? When they finally reached their campsite, the work was just beginning. Each legion built a fully fortified camp. Every day, whether they stayed for a night or a month, the procedure was always the same. Trenches needed to be dug, stakes needed to be driven, earthen walls needed to be built. All this after a full day of marching carrying heavy equipment. The Roman camp always followed the same geometric pattern, no matter where it was built. It was a perfect rectangle with internal streets organized in a regular grid. Each soldier knew exactly where his tent should be, where the communal bathrooms were, and where the commander's tent was located. This standardization wasn't just organizational efficiency, it was military strategy. In the event of a night attack, each soldier could move in the dark knowing exactly where to find his comrades. And equipment. Building the camp took several hours of intense labor. You dug trenches over a meter deep, erected palisades with sharpened stakes, and built watchtowers at the corners, and all this after already marching all day. There was no rest, no respite. The work continued until everything was perfect, exactly as the military manuals demanded. When you finally lay down to sleep, it was in a cramped tent shared with 7 other men. There was no privacy, no comfort. You slept on the hard ground, covered only by a woolen cloak that served as both a blanket and part of your uniform. And in a few hours, the trumpets would sound again, and the whole cycle would begin again. But perhaps the most psychologically draining aspect of life in the Legion was the constant threat of death, not just in battle, where death was an obvious possibility, but at any moment due to military punishments. Roman commanders had absolute power over the life and death of their soldiers. A single act of disobedience, a moment of weakness, a failure to carry out an order, and you could be executed on the spot. Punishments were creative and brutal. Besides the decimation I mentioned earlier, there were other forms of collective punishment. If a unit lost its eagles, the Legion's sacred banners, all soldiers in that unit were considered dishonored and could be sold into slavery. If an entire legion fled from battle, it could be disbanded and all its members permanently exiled. Individual punishments ranged in severity. Minor offenses resulted in reduced rations or extra work. Moderate offenses led to public flogging or imprisonment. Serious offenses resulted in execution, often by particularly painful methods such as crucifixion or being thrown to wild animals. The most disturbing aspect was that these punishments were carried out by their own comrades in arms. In the case of decimation, soldiers had to beat to death 1 in 10 of their comrades, chosen by lot. Imagine having to club to death the man who slept next to you every night, who shared your rations when you were sick, who covered your back. In combat, the psychology behind this brutality was calculated. The Romans understood that soldiers who feared their own commanders more than the enemy would fight more ferociously. It was better to die gloriously in battle than to live with the dishonor of being considered a coward by their superiors. Battle Training was so intense that many veterans said real battles were less stressful than drills. The Romans created combat simulations so realistic that they included real injuries and even accidental deaths. They believed that if you could survive the training, you could survive anything the enemy threw at you. A fascinating aspect of Roman training was the focus on building military infrastructure. Every Roman soldier was also an engineer. You learned to build roads, bridges, aqueducts, siege engines, and fortifications. It wasn't just about swinging a sword. It was about creating and maintaining the logistical apparatus that allowed the Roman army to operate in distant territories for years on end. Roman roads are famous to this day, but few realize they were built primarily by soldiers. Each legion carried engineering tools and knew how to measure terrain, calculate gradients, and build structures that would last centuries. When you see Roman ruins still standing 2,000 years later, remember that they were built by common soldiers using techniques they learned during their military service. Roman military medicine was also surprisingly advanced for its time. Military surgeons performed complex operations, including amputations and projectile removal. But if you were injured, don't expect much in the way of anesthesia. At best, you'd be given a piece of leather to bite on while the doctor worked on you with tools that had been heated over a fire to sterilize. Roman military hospitals were probably the most advanced medical establishments in the ancient world. But that didn't mean they were pleasant. If you survived the initial surgery, you still faced weeks or months of recovery in conditions that would make a modern hospital seem like a five-star resort. Infections were common and often fatal. Many soldiers who survived battles later died from infected wounds. A legionary's retirement, if he survived 25 years of mandatory service, was theoretically compensatory. Veterans received a plot of land or a sum of money, Roman citizenship, if they didn't already have it, and certain legal privileges. But the reality often differed from the promise. Many veterans discovered that the promised lands were in hostile, newly conquered regions, where they would have to fight again, this time as settlers, to defend their property against rebellious local tribes. Retirement money, when paid, was often insufficient to maintain a decent standard of living, especially considering that many veterans had developed chronic health problems during their service. The psychological aspect of Roman military service was perhaps the most devastating to the modern mind. You spent decades of your life in an environment where violence was not only common but celebrated. You were trained to kill efficiently and without hesitation. You saw things that would scar any normal person for life. Roman battles were not the clean and honorable encounters Hollywood films suggest. They were chaotic, bloody, and traumatic events where men were torn apart by swords, trampled by horses, or slowly tortured to death from wounds that took hours to heal. The smell of blood, urine, feces, and burning flesh created a sensory environment that few could endure without lasting psychological consequences. After the battle came the plunder, and here the Romans displayed a particularly brutal side of their nature. Conquered cities were systematically pillaged, civilians were massacred or sold into slavery. Wealth was distributed among the soldiers based on their rank, but even common soldiers received their share of the spoils. This brutality wasn't seen as moral or immoral by Roman standards. It was simply part of the job. If you had modern qualms about killing innocent civilians or destroying cultural heritage, you were deemed unfit for military service. The ability to turn off your humanity when necessary was seen as an essential military virtue. The logistical system that kept the legions running was a marvel of organization, but also a constant source of stress for the soldiers. Each legion needed to be supplied with food, water, equipment, horses, and thousands of other items necessary to keep 40,000 men functioning. As an effective fighting unit, when supply lines were cut by the enemy, soldiers faced real hunger. Not the hunger you feel when you skip lunch, but the hunger that kills. Roman soldiers on campaign ate anything they could find: dead horses, dogs, rats, tree bark, boiled leather. There are historical accounts of entire units resorting to cannibalism. When other food sources ran out, water was another constant problem. Modern soldiers may be accustomed to water purification systems, But the Romans relied on finding natural springs or carrying enough water for thousands of men for days or weeks. Diarrhea and other waterborne diseases killed more Roman soldiers than battles. Winter was particularly brutal for legions stationed in cold regions. Roman soldiers lacked clothing suitable for extreme climates. They wore essentially the same clothing in the African desert and the frozen forests of Germania. Hypothermia, pneumonia, and other cold-related illnesses decimated entire units during the winter months. Even when not on active campaign, life in the permanent forts was harsh. Soldiers spent months or years in remote positions on the empire's frontier, far from any civilization, facing constant attacks from hostile tribes. The boredom was broken only by periods of terror when the fort was attacked. The monotony of Roman military life was occasionally broken by festivals and celebrations. But even these had a military character. Competitions included mock combat, endurance races, and demonstrations of skill with weapons. There was no passive entertainment. Everything was designed to keep soldiers physically and mentally fit for combat. Religion played an important role in Roman military life, but it was a military religion. Soldiers worshipped war gods, made sacrifices before battle, and participated in rituals that reinforced military discipline and loyalty to the empire. There was no spiritual comfort or philosophical reflection. Religion was simply another tool for creating more effective soldiers. Communications in the legions relied on a complex system of visual and audible signals. Soldiers had to memorize dozens of different signals, transmitted by trumpets, drums, flags, and campfires. A misinterpretation of a signal could result in tactical errors that cost lives. The pressure of constantly being alert to these signals, even while sleeping, created a constant state of stress. Advancement in the Roman military hierarchy was theoretically based on merit, but in practice it depended on a combination of military skill, political connections, and sheer luck. Most soldiers never advanced beyond the lowest ranks, serving their 25 years as privates. Those who did earn promotions often found that leadership positions brought even more responsibility and stress. Centurions, the legion's middle officers, had a particularly high mortality rate because they were expected to lead by example. They marched in front during attacks, stayed behind during retreats, and were personally responsible for their unit's performance. Many experienced centurions died not from a lack of skill, but from taking unnecessary risks to maintain their troops' morale. Roman military technology was impressive for its time, but terrifying to use. Catapults and ballista were powerful weapons, but also extremely dangerous for their operators. Accidents were common, and soldiers were often crushed or dismembered by their own weapons when something went wrong. During Operation. Roman siege equipment included mobile towers, battering rams, and assault ladders that allowed for the assault on fortified cities. But operating this equipment meant working under a constant barrage of arrows, stones, boiling oil, and other defensive projectiles. Casualty rates during siege operations were astronomical. Roman military engineering included tunneling techniques to collapse enemy walls. Soldiers spent weeks or months digging narrow, claustrophobic tunnels beneath enemy fortifications, always at risk of collapse, flooding, or underground counterattacks. Many soldiers developed chronic respiratory problems due to the dust and toxic gases encountered during these operations. Naval battles presented unique challenges. Roman soldiers, even those who couldn't swim, were forced to fight on warships when the ships sank, which happened frequently. Soldiers wearing heavy armor had little chance of survival in the water. Even naval victories resulted in high casualty rates due to fires, collisions, and drowning. Perhaps the most psychologically devastating aspect of Roman military life was the constant uncertainty about the future. Soldiers never knew where they would be sent next, how long they would be away from home, or whether they would return alive. Families were often left without news for years. Many soldiers would find upon their return that their wives had remarried, or that their children no longer recognized them. Communication with family was spotty and unreliable. Letters took months to reach their destination, if they arrived at all. Many families only discovered their soldiers had died when other veterans returned with the news. Years later, There was no official notification system for families of fallen soldiers. Social pressure on Roman soldiers was intense. They represented not only themselves, but also their families, their hometowns, and the empire itself. Failing in combat was not just a personal matter, it was a matter of family honor that would affect future generations. This pressure created an environment where soldiers often made dangerous or even suicidal choices to avoid the perception of cowardice. The Roman concept of military glory required soldiers to actively seek out dangerous situations where they could demonstrate bravery. Soldiers who survived by being cautious or strategic were often despised by their peers. Roman military culture rewarded aggressiveness and risk-taking, even when these qualities reduced one's chances of survival. War wounds were treated as badges of honor, but the medical realities were brutal. Soldiers often survived severe injuries, only to face chronic pain, permanent disabilities, and lifelong health problems. There was no concept of disability retirement. Wounded soldiers who could no longer fight were simply discharged without further benefits. Violence was not limited to the battlefield. Roman military discipline included regular corporal punishment. For minor infractions, soldiers were routinely whipped, beaten, or forced to perform extreme physical labor as punishment. This institutionalized violence created an environment where brutality was normalized and accepted as part of everyday life. Hygiene standards in the legions were rudimentary at best. Soldiers would go weeks or months without proper baths, especially during campaigns. Skin diseases, parasites, and infections were endemic. The smell of a Roman military camp was so intense, it could be detected from miles away. Roman military food was nutritionally inadequate and often spoiled. Soldiers suffered from scurvy, beriberi, and other diseases related to nutritional deficiency. Dental problems were widespread due to a diet based on stale bread and poorly processed grains. Many soldiers lost all their teeth before completing their service. Sleep was frequently interrupted by guard duty, false alarms, and night attacks. Soldiers developed chronic sleep problems that affected their judgment and reaction time in critical situations. Constant fatigue was accepted as a normal part of military life. Sanitary conditions in military camps were primitive. Communal toilets were open pits that created ideal conditions for the spread of disease. Inadequate drainage systems resulted in camps frequently flooded with contaminated water. Epidemics of dysentery, typhus, and other communicable diseases could wipe out entire military units. The psychological impact of regularly witnessing extreme violence went unrecognized and untreated. Soldiers who developed what we now know as post-traumatic stress disorder were considered weak or cowardly. There was no concept of mental health or psychological treatment. Soldiers were expected to simply get over any emotional trauma. Death in the Roman legion was rarely as swift or glorious as portrayed in fiction. Most soldiers died slowly from infected wounds, disease, or starvation. Those who died in battle often lay wounded in the field for hours or days before dying. There were no emergency medical services or rapid evacuation for the wounded. The Romans' treatment of prisoners of war was notoriously brutal. Soldiers were often forced to participate in or witness torture, mass executions, and other atrocities. This constant exposure to the dehumanization of enemies had profound psychological effects that stayed with soldiers for the rest of their lives. Corruption among officers was endemic and directly affected the lives of ordinary soldiers. Supplies intended for the troops were often sold on the black market by greedy officers. Quality equipment was replaced with inferior versions, with the difference pocketed by superiors. Soldiers knew about this corruption, but could do nothing without risking severe punishment. The Roman military justice system was arbitrary and brutal. Soldiers could be executed based solely on the word of a superior officer, without trial or opportunity for defense. There was no appeal or review process. A moment of displeasure with a superior could result in immediate death. Roman military campaigns often lasted years, keeping soldiers away from home for periods exceeding a decade. During this time, soldiers lost contact with their home communities. Their families became separated, and their civic skills atrophied. Many veterans found they no longer had a place in civil society after years of military training. Roman military propaganda created unrealistic expectations of glory and military rewards. Young men were recruited with promises of wealth and honor, only to discover that the reality of military service was mostly suffering and deprivation. This disconnect between expectations and reality created resentment and disillusionment among the troops. Cultural isolation was another devastating aspect of Roman military service. Soldiers were often sent to regions with languages, customs, and climates completely different from their hometowns. This cultural alienation, combined with physical isolation, created a sense of ruthlessness that profoundly affected soldiers' emotional well-being. The pressure to conform within the legions eliminated individuality and personal expression. Soldiers were expected to think, act, and even feel in ways prescribed by military command. Any sign of independence or creativity was seen as a threat to discipline and harshly punished. Now, after delving deeply into the brutal reality of life in the Roman legion, you're probably beginning to understand why I said at the outset that you wouldn't last a day. In this relentless military machine, it's not a matter of physical strength or personal courage. It's a matter of psychological conditioning, extreme resilience, and an ability to accept levels of suffering and brutality that are completely outside the modern human experience. The Roman legion was effective precisely because it transformed ordinary men into something that transcended normal human limitations. They created a military culture so intense, so all-consuming, that soldiers literally became extensions of the imperial military machine. But the price of this transformation was individual humanity, physical and mental health, and often life itself. When you look at the ruins of Roman aqueducts, the roads that still stand 2,000 years later, the colosseums and temples that define our image of ancient greatness, remember that every stone was laid by men who lived through this organized nightmare we call the Roman legion. They paid the ultimate price so that an empire could dominate the known world. And that price was so high that few of us today could even comprehend, much less pay. But there are even more aspects of this military life that would make the experience utterly unbearable. Let's delve even deeper into the details that would make any modern person question their sanity for even considering joining the ranks of the legions. The concept of privacy simply didn't exist in Roman military life. You slept, ate, bathed, and even used the bathrooms in the constant company of hundreds of other men. There was never a moment when you were alone with your thoughts. This complete lack of personal space created a constant psychological pressure that pushed many soldiers to the brink of sanity. Imagine never being able to cry in private, never being able to process your emotions without dozens of other men watching and judging every facial expression, every sigh, every moment of weakness. Roman masculinity demanded that soldiers constantly display strength, even when they were internally falling apart. The initiation rituals for new recruits were especially brutal. Veterans viewed the newcomers as their own amusement and created traditions of humiliation that tested not only physical endurance, but also their ability to endure extreme degradation. Recruits were forced to perform humiliating tasks, endure violent games that often resulted in serious injuries, and undergo rituals that today would be considered psychological torture. The Roman military camaraderie system was a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it created intense bonds between soldiers who fought side by side. On the other, it created extreme social pressure to conform. Soldiers who didn't fit perfectly into the Roman military mold faced social ostracism that could be more devastating than official punishments. If you displayed any trace of sensitivity, intellectuality, or individuality that clashed with the brutal military mentality, you would become a constant target of ridicule and persecution by your own comrades. Roman military culture brooked no differences and systematically broke any soldier who didn't conform to the desired profile. Superstition played a huge role in Roman military life, creating yet another source of stress and anxiety. Soldiers fervently believed in omens, portents, and divine signs that could determine the success or failure of entire campaigns. A bird flying in the wrong direction, the shape of a sacrificed animal's entrails, or even someone sneezing at the wrong moment, could all be interpreted as signs of impending disaster. This superstitious mindset created an environment where soldiers lived in constant fear of actions or events that could bring bad luck to the entire unit. Not only did they have to worry about external enemies, but they also had to worry about the possibility of inadvertently causing a calamity for thousands of their comrades through some act considered unlucky by military tradition. Roman generals were masters of psychological manipulation and used these superstitions to control their troops. They organized elaborate sacrifices before battles, consulted oracles for strategic decisions, and interpreted natural signs in ways that supported their military objectives. Soldiers who questioned these practices were viewed as ruthless and potentially traitors. The Roman military hierarchy was so rigid that it created an internal caste system, where rank determined not only one's duties, but also one's basic humanity. In the eyes of superiors, ranking soldiers were treated little better than disposable equipment. Senior officers could do literally anything to common soldiers without consequence, including gratuitous physical violence, public humiliation, or even death on a personal whim. This systematic dehumanization was intentional. Roman commanders understood that soldiers who saw themselves as fully human beings would hesitate in situations where they needed to act as killing machines, so they created a system that gradually stripped soldiers of their individual humanity until they functioned purely as extensions of the imperial will. The process of dehumanization began at the moment of recruitment and continued throughout their service. Soldiers lost their individual names and were identified only by numbers and ranks. They lost the right to make personal decisions about any aspect of their lives. They lost connection with their pre-military identities. When they finally completed their 25 years of service, many veterans found they could no longer function in civilian society. They had been so thoroughly shaped by their military experience that they no longer knew how to be normal citizens. Many ended up re-enlisting for additional tours, simply because military life was the only thing they knew. Alcoholism was endemic among Roman soldiers as a way to cope with the constant stress and trauma of military life. Soldiers drank whatever fermented beverages they could find, from inferior wine to local spirits made with dubious ingredients. Alcohol was often their only mental escape from the brutal reality of their existence. But even alcohol carried risks in Roman military life. Soldiers caught drunk while on duty faced severe punishments. Binge drinking that resulted in disruptive behavior could lead to summary execution. And the quality of available beverages was so poor that alcohol poisoning was a common cause of death and permanent disability. Sexuality presented unique challenges for Roman soldiers. During long campaigns, soldiers would go years without contact with women. Solutions to this situation created complex and often violent social dynamics. Within the legions, relationships between soldiers were tolerated, but not officially recognized, creating additional emotional tensions. As legions conquered territories, soldiers often formed relationships with local women, but these relationships were unstable and problematic. Women were often slaves or war refugees, creating extreme power imbalances. Soldiers could be transferred at any time, forcing them to abandon the families they had created. Children born of these unions faced ambiguous legal status. They were not automatically granted Roman citizenship, but they were also not fully accepted by the local communities. Many soldiers never met their children or saw them only occasionally during brief periods of leave. Roman military documentation was meticulous and relentless. Every aspect of a soldier's life was recorded, monitored, and used for future evaluations. There was no escaping past mistakes or reinventing one's military identity. A single incident of cowardice or disobedience would follow you throughout your military career. These records included not only official actions, but also officers' subjective assessments of their personality, trustworthiness, and future potential. Soldiers knew they were being constantly watched and judged, creating a paranoia that affected every social interaction within the legion. The informant system within the legions meant that soldiers could never completely trust even their closest friends. soldiers were encouraged to report suspicious behavior among their comrades, and these reports were taken very seriously by their commanders. An accusation of disloyalty, even without solid evidence, could ruin a military career or lead to execution. Equipment maintenance was a personal responsibility that added another layer of stress. To military life, soldiers were personally responsible for the condition of their weapons, armor, and other equipment. Any damage or wear had to be repaired at the soldier's own expense, often using techniques they had to learn on their own. Poorly maintained equipment not only put the individual soldier at risk, but was also seen as a threat to the effectiveness of the entire unit. Surprise inspections were common, and soldiers whose equipment failed to meet standards faced punishments that could include pay cuts, overtime, or physical punishment. The pressure to keep equipment in perfect condition created constant anxiety. Soldiers spent hours of their free time cleaning, repairing, and polishing their equipment. Even small scratches or stains could result in public humiliation during inspections. The climate was a constant enemy that Roman soldiers had few resources to combat. Roman military uniforms were designed for the Mediterranean climate and offered inadequate protection against extreme weather. Soldiers stationed in northern regions suffered from extreme cold, while those in deserts faced potentially fatal heat. There was no system of sick leave for weather-related conditions. Soldiers were expected to function normally regardless of temperature, precipitation, or other weather conditions. Frostbite, heat stroke, and other weather-related conditions were considered signs of personal weakness rather than legitimate medical problems. The lack of suitable clothing for different climates meant that soldiers often improvised protection using local materials or items captured from the enemy. But wearing non-standard equipment was technically against military regulations, creating a dilemma where soldiers had to choose between physical comfort and regulatory compliance. Tropical diseases presented special challenges for legions operating in regions such as Africa and the Middle East. Malaria, yellow fever, and other insect-borne diseases decimated entire units. Soldiers lacked knowledge about disease prevention and often attributed outbreaks to divine curses or other supernatural causes. Medical treatments for tropical diseases were primitive and often more dangerous than the diseases themselves. Bloodletting, violent purgations, and other heroic treatments killed as many soldiers as they cured. Soldiers who survived serious illnesses often faced chronic health problems that affected their ability to serve for the rest of their careers. Communication with the outside world was extremely limited and unreliable. Soldiers could go years without receiving news from home. When letters finally arrived, they often brought news of deaths, marriages, births, and other important events that had occurred months or even years before. This disconnect from the civilian world created a psychologically devastating sense of irrelevance and isolation. Soldiers began to feel that their pre-military lives were unreal or belonged to other people. They lost emotional connection to families and communities they could barely remember clearly. The economic impact of military service on soldiers' families was often catastrophic. Families lost not only the soldier's economic contribution, but also his physical protection and social leadership. Soldiers' wives faced discrimination and exploitation, especially in communities where they were seen as essentially widows. Soldiers' children grew up without father figures and often developed behavioral and social problems. Many ended up following in their parents' footsteps and enlisting in the legions, not out of a military vocation, but due to a lack of other economic opportunities. The infant mortality rate in military families was significantly higher than in the civilian population, partly due to poverty and stress, but also due to the lack of male protection in societies where single women were vulnerable to violence and exploitation. The psychological wounds of Roman military service were as permanent as the physical ones, but they received even less treatment or recognition. Soldiers who developed what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder were simply considered weak or cowardly. There was no concept of mental health or the need for psychological treatment. Nightmares, flashbacks, and other symptoms of trauma were seen as signs of a deficient character. Soldiers who admitted to having emotional problems faced social humiliation. and potentially official punishment for faking illness to avoid military duties. The only socially acceptable way to deal with psychological trauma was through increased violence. Soldiers were encouraged to channel their anguish into aggression against enemies, creating a cycle where trauma begat more trauma for both the soldiers and their victims. The Roman concept of masculinity required men to suppress all emotions, except anger and pride. Soldiers who displayed fear, sadness, or vulnerability were considered unfit for military service. This forced emotional suppression created deep-seated psychological problems that manifested in destructive ways. Domestic violence was endemic among Roman military families, partly as a result of soldiers failing to adequately process the trauma of their military experiences. Veterans often brought the brutality and controlling methods learned in the army into their personal relationships. The social expectation that veterans would automatically be respected leaders in their communities created additional tensions when many returned with mental health issues, substance abuse, or other issues that made them unsuitable for leadership roles. The Roman military retirement system, while generous in theory, was often inadequate in practice. Many veterans found that 25 years of military service had left them unsuited for civilian life. They lacked the transferable skills, social connections, or financial resources to thrive as civilians. The lands offered for retirement were often in remote and hostile regions where veterans had to fight again, this time as settlers, to establish viable farms. Many veterans lost their lands to local invaders, natural disasters, or simply because they were unable to make the transition from soldier to farmer. The social isolation faced by veterans was particularly brutal. After decades of living in a purely male, military-dominated society, many veterans were unable to interact with civilians or reintegrate into normal communities. They formed isolated groups of ex-soldiers that often became problematic for local authorities. The cultural glorification of Roman warfare masked the brutal realities we are exploring here. Roman poets, historians, and other intellectuals created a narrative of heroism and glory that attracted young men to military service but bore little relation to the actual experiences of ordinary soldiers. This disconnect between the public image of military life and its reality created deep disillusionment among recruits, who discovered that their romantic expectations were completely unrealistic. Many soldiers felt betrayed not only by their recruiters, but by Roman society itself, which had deceived them about the nature of their future experiences. The pressure to live up to impossible heroic ideals created constant anxiety among soldiers, who knew that their actual experiences of fear, suffering, and moral commitment did not match social expectations. They had to maintain a facade of heroism while internally dealing with the very different reality of their lives. The concept of Roman military honor was both the driving force and the curse of the legionary system. Soldiers were taught that death was preferable to dishonor, but the definitions of honor were so specific and arbitrary that it was nearly impossible to avoid violating them at some point during a long military career. Acts that would be considered wise military prudence today were often seen as cowardice by Roman standards. Soldiers who avoided unnecessary risks to preserve their lives and the lives of their men were often punished for not demonstrating sufficient bravery. The pressure to constantly demonstrate physical prowess led soldiers to take foolish risks that didn't contribute to strategic military objectives. Many soldiers died not out of military necessity, but because they felt the need to prove their courage to avoid social humiliation. Rivalries between different legions created additional tensions that often escalated into actual violence. Soldiers were encouraged to view other legions as competitors, and this healthy competition often turned into genuine animosity that resulted in fights, sabotage, and even deaths. During periods of relative peace, when there were no external enemies to fight, these internal rivalries intensified. Soldiers channeled their trained aggression against each other, creating disciplinary problems that commanders struggled to control. The lack of external enemies also created psychological problems for soldiers who had been conditioned for constant violence. Many developed depression, anxiety, and destructive behaviors when they lacked appropriate outlets for their trained aggression. The Roman military reward system was designed to encourage individual bravery, but it often created dynamics that undermined the effectiveness of the unit as a whole. Soldiers competing for decorations and recognition sometimes placed their own interests above the mission's objectives. The most valuable rewards went to acts of spectacular individual bravery, not to consistent contributions to the unit's success. This created incentives for soldiers to take unnecessary risks or seek out dangerous situations where they could excel, even when doing so undermined the overall strategy. Soldiers who performed essential but unglamorous work rarely received recognition, creating resentment and lowering morale. Engineers, supply, communications, and other essential specialists were often overlooked in favor of combatants who had opportunities to demonstrate bravery in dramatic situations. Now, after delving so deeply into the darker aspects of life in the Roman legion, you're probably wondering how any civilization could create and maintain such a brutally effective system for so many centuries. The answer lies in understanding that the system worked precisely because it was so brutal. The Romans understood something fundamental about human nature that modern societies often choose to ignore, that ordinary people can be transformed into extremely effective instruments of organized violence if the right conditions are created and maintained. They deliberately constructed a system that stripped soldiers of their individual humanity to maximize their effectiveness as components of an imperial military machine. Every cruel and seemingly unnecessary aspect of legionary life served a specific purpose. In creating this ideal soldier, the brutality of the training wasn't gratuitous sadism, it was psychological conditioning. The relentless discipline wasn't tyranny, it was behavioral programming. The systematic dehumanization wasn't cruelty, it was social engineering. The result was the creation of the most effective military force the ancient world had ever seen. For over 1,000 years, Roman legions dominated battlefields against enemies who often outnumbered them, outgunned them, or outmaneuvered them. They conquered and maintained control over territories stretching from Scotland to Sudan, from Portugal to Mesopotamia. But the human cost of this military success was astronomically high. Millions of men paid with their lives, their health, and their humanity to build and maintain the Roman Empire. Their sacrifices created a civilization that influences our world to this day. But they personally rarely lived to see or enjoy the fruits of their suffering. When you walk the streets of modern Rome, when you visit the ruins of amphitheaters in cities across Europe, when you drive on roads that follow routes originally laid out by Roman military engineers 2,000 years ago, you are seeing monuments built with the blood, sweat, and tears of soldiers whose names have been forgotten by history. Each stone in these monuments represents hours of forced labor performed by men far from home, missing their families, suffering from chronic illnesses, and carrying wounds that would never fully heal. Each road represents thousands of miles marched by soldiers whose feet bled inside ill-fitting boots, carrying equipment that made them groan in pain with every step. The greatness of the Roman Empire that we admire today was built on a foundation of human suffering that is difficult for modern minds to fully comprehend. I say this not to diminish Roman achievements, but to give proper credit to the men who truly made them possible through their extreme personal sacrifices. And that's why I can say with absolute certainty that you, I, and virtually anyone alive today wouldn't last a day in the Roman legion. Not because we're physically weak or morally inferior, but because we're products of a society that values the individual, that recognizes human limits, that accepts vulnerability as part of human nature. We were raised in a world where we expect our basic rights to be respected, where we assume we will have some control over our own lives, where we believe we should be treated with basic human dignity. These expectations, which we consider natural and universal, were completely foreign to the Roman military world. The Roman legion functioned specifically because it rejected these modern notions of individual rights and personal dignity. It transformed men into specialized tools for imperial conquest, and tools have no rights, no feelings, No personal needs to be considered. So, when you caught yourself thinking during this video that perhaps you could have handled some aspects of legionary life, remember that you were thinking about them individually, as separate challenges that you could overcome one at a time. But the reality is that all of these aspects operated simultaneously every day for decades, without respite, without relief, without hope that things would get better. Life in the Roman legion wasn't a series of difficult challenges that could be overcome with determination and courage. It was a fundamentally different existence from normal human life, one where every instinct for self-preservation, every impulse of individuality, every basic emotional need had to be constantly suppressed in favor of the demands of the military system. And perhaps the most disturbing aspect of all this is that it worked. It worked so well that it created the most enduring and influential civilization in Western history. This should make us reflect on the nature of humanity, the price of civilizational success, and what aspects of the human condition we are willing to sacrifice for the sake of greater collective goals. The Roman legion represents both the pinnacle of what human beings can achieve when they organize themselves with singular purpose, and the abyss of what we are willing to do to one another when we believe the ends justify the means. It is simultaneously a triumph of human organization and a tragedy of the individual human experience. So the next time you hear someone romanticizing old-school military life, or suggesting that our modern society is soft compared to the real men of the past, remember what you've learned here today. Remember that those real men paid a price for their toughness that none of us should have to pay, and that our modern softness represents not weakness, but moral progress. The true measure of a civilization is not how effectively it can transform its citizens into instruments of war, but how well it can enable them to flourish as full human beings. And by this measure, as impressive as it was militarily, the Roman system failed in ways we are still learning to understand and avoid in our own societies. But there are even deeper layers of this Roman military experience that we need to explore to truly understand why you couldn't survive even the first moments of your life as a legionary. Let's dive into the more specific and technical aspects that would make your experience absolutely unbearable. The process of transforming from civilian to Roman soldier began with the complete destruction of one's previous identity. It wasn't simply a matter of learning new skills or adapting to a new routine. It was a deliberate and systematic process of breaking down one's existing personality and rebuilding it according to Roman military needs. In the early days of training, recruits were subjected to weeks of intentional sleep deprivation. It wasn't just a matter of waking up early. It was a psychological strategy to break down their mental resistance. Soldiers in training were awakened at irregular intervals throughout the night for drills, surprise inspections, or simply to march in circles with no apparent purpose. The sleep deprivation served multiple purposes. First, it left the recruits in a vulnerable mental state where they were more susceptible to conditioning. Second, it impaired their ability to form independent thoughts or question orders. Third, it created a psychological dependence on the instructors, who controlled when and for how long the recruits could rest. Roman instructors were masters of psychologically breaking techniques that would make modern torturers look like amateurs. They knew exactly how to apply physical and emotional pressure to transform proud men into obedient soldiers. The process was so effective that most recruits underwent a fundamental personality change within a few weeks. A particularly effective technique was selective social isolation. Instructors identified recruits who showed signs of natural leadership or independence of mind and separated them from the group. These recruits were then subjected to intensive humiliation designed to shatter any sense of superiority or individuality they might have. Recruits were forced to perform degrading tasks in front of their peers, such as cleaning latrines with their bare hands, eating food off the floor, or performing physical exercises to the point of collapse while others watched. The goal was not only to punish, but to publicly demonstrate that no individual was special or above the military system. Physical conditioning went far beyond what any modern athlete would consider safe or healthy. Recruits were forced to perform exercises to the point where their bodies literally began to break down. Stress fractures, Severe muscle injuries and joint dislocations were considered a normal part of the training process. But the most brutal aspect was that recruits injured during training received minimal medical treatment and were expected to continue training with their injuries. The logic was that soldiers needed to be able to function even when injured, so training should replicate those conditions from the start. Recruits who couldn't keep up due to injuries were publicly humiliated and often expelled from the legions. But expulsion didn't simply mean returning home. It meant losing Roman citizenship, being branded a coward for life, and often facing total social ostracism in their home communities. The diet during training was deliberately inadequate to create conditions of nutritional stress. Recruits received only enough calories to survive, never enough to feel satisfied or comfortable. This constant hunger served to break down their mental toughness and make them more docile to orders. The quality of the food was purposefully poor, not out of economic necessity, but as part of psychological conditioning. Recruits were taught they were not entitled to comfort or pleasure, even in the most basic needs like food. Better food was occasionally offered as a reward for exceptional performance, creating a conditioning system based on deprivation and irregular reward. Combat training included practices that today would be considered attempted murder. Recruits fought each other with real weapons, not just wooden swords. Serious injuries and accidental deaths were accepted as a necessary part of the process of creating soldiers who would not hesitate to kill when necessary. Instructors often placed recruits in situations where they had to choose between seriously injuring a fellow soldier or facing severe punishment themselves. These forced choices were designed to break down any moral qualms the recruits might have about violence against others. The most psychologically devastating aspect was that recruits were forced to participate in punishing fellow soldiers who failed to meet the standards. If a recruit was caught sleeping during a watch, for example, all the other recruits were forced to beat him. This created a collective complicity in violence that made it impossible to maintain a sense of moral innocence. The language used during training was deliberately dehumanizing. Recruits were not called by their names, but by numbers or degrading nicknames. Instructors referred to them as animals, objects, or using terms that emphasized their worthlessness as individuals. This language conditioned recruits to see themselves as less than human. Orders were given in ways that brooked no interpretation or questioning. Recruits learned to react instantly to specific commands without cognitively processing what they were doing. This automatic conditioning was essential for creating soldiers who would obey orders, even in situations of extreme stress or confusion. The process of establishing loyalty to the Legion involved breaking all other loyalties recruits might have. They were forced to publicly renounce their families, their communities, and even their personal gods in favor of the Roman military identity. Letters from home were frequently intercepted and destroyed to accelerate this process of disconnection. Recruits who displayed excessive homesickness were subjected to humiliating rituals designed to associate these emotions with pain and shame. They were forced to burn personal items brought from home, publicly renounce their family names, and swear that the Legion was now their only true family. The creation of group identity was based on shared hostility toward outsiders. Recruits were taught to view all non-Romans as natural enemies deserving death or slavery. This us versus them mentality was essential for creating soldiers willing to commit atrocities against civilian populations without moral question. But even within the Roman world, soldiers were taught to view themselves as superior to civilians. They developed contempt for people who had not served in the legions, seeing them as weak, cowardly, and unworthy of respect. This artificial superiority compensated for the brutality of their own experiences, giving them a sense of purpose and worth. The training included torture simulations to prepare soldiers for the possibility of capture by the enemy. Recruits were subjected to intense physical pain to teach them how to resist breaking under interrogation. But these sessions also served to normalize torture, making them more willing to apply it when it was their turn to interrogate prisoners. The specific torture techniques taught to Roman soldiers were refined through centuries of practical experience. Soldiers learned not only how to inflict maximum pain, but also how to keep prisoners alive. and conscious during prolonged periods of torture. This knowledge was seen as an essential military skill, not as shadowy or morally questionable. The use of torture was presented as both a tactical necessity and a moral obligation. Soldiers were taught that information obtained through torture saved Roman lives, and that failing to use all available methods to obtain intelligence was a betrayal of one's comrades. This rationalization made it easier for soldiers to engage in activities they would normally abhor. Psychological conditioning involved gradual exposure to increasing levels of violence. Recruits began by watching executions, then participating in lesser punishments, then administering severe punishments, and finally participating in organized massacres. Each stage further broke down their moral resistance until extreme violence became routine. The effectiveness of this conditioning process was demonstrated by the ease with which Roman soldiers killed not only enemy combatants, but also innocent civilians during pacification operations. They had been so thoroughly reprogrammed that they felt no emotional conflict when killing children, the elderly, or other obviously harmless people. The final initiation rituals to complete basic training included acts that today we would consider crimes against humanity. New soldiers were often forced to participate in mass executions of prisoners or massacres of rebellious populations as their official baptism of fire into the legion. These rituals served multiple psychological purposes. First, they created a shared experience of extreme violence that permanently bonded soldiers to one another through complicity. Second, they shattered any remaining moral sensibilities that might interfere with future military operations. Third, they conclusively demonstrated that they had crossed a line that permanently separated them from normal civilian society. Soldiers who hesitated or showed reluctance during these rituals faced immediate execution. There were no second chances or opportunities for reconsideration. The system was designed to eliminate anyone who harbored sufficient moral scruples to interfere with military effectiveness. Daily life after completing basic training offered no respite from this brutality. Veteran soldiers were expected to maintain and even escalate the patterns of violence established during training. Any sign of softening or developing moral conscience was seen as military deterioration that needed to be corrected. The promotion system specifically rewarded soldiers who demonstrated a capacity and willingness for extreme violence. Soldiers who killed more enemies, tortured information more effectively, or led particularly brutal operations against civilian populations received recognition and advancement in the military ranks. This incentive structure created a competition among soldiers to see who could be the most brutal and effective in inflicting violence. Soldiers developed specialties in different forms of cruelty, taking pride in their unique ability to inflict suffering and death. The normalization of extreme violence had profound psychological effects that extended far beyond military life. Soldiers lost the ability to form normal emotional relationships because they had been conditioned to view other human beings primarily as potential threats or victims. The capacity for empathy was systematically destroyed through repeated exposure to extreme human suffering combined with punishments for any display of compassion. Soldiers learned that survival depended on completely suppressing any emotional response to the suffering of others. This anti-empathic conditioning was so complete that many veterans never regained the ability to feel normal emotional connection with others. They became functionally psychopathic, capable of social functioning, but incapable of experiencing the emotions that make human relationships meaningful. The mind control techniques used by the Roman legions were so advanced that they influenced military systems for thousands of years to come. Many of the basic methods of psychological breakdown and reconditioning developed by the Romans are still recognizable in modern military training programs, albeit in much attenuated forms. The most disturbing aspect is that these methods worked precisely because they exploited fundamental vulnerabilities in the human psyche. The Romans discovered that virtually anyone could be transformed into an effective instrument of violence if the right techniques were applied systematically and relentlessly. Individual resistance to this conditioning process was rare and generally ineffective. Even people with strong moral or religious convictions could be broken if subjected to the Roman system for long enough. The psychological pressure was simply too great for most human minds to withstand indefinitely. The few individuals who managed to maintain some sense of independent moral identity generally did not survive the training process. They were identified as unsuitable for military service and eliminated through training accidents or executions for insubordination. The end result was an army composed entirely of individuals who had been fundamentally altered. Psychologically, they were no longer the same people who had entered training. They were manufactured products of an industrial soldier creation process refined through centuries of experimentation and practice. This transformation was irreversible in most cases. Even after completing their military service, former soldiers retained the psychological changes imposed during their training and active service. They remained fundamentally different from people who had never undergone the Roman military conditioning process. Roman society developed specific institutions to deal with these psychologically altered veterans. Military colonies were established in conquered territories not only as a security measure, but also as a way to isolate former soldiers from the normal civilian population, which might be disturbed by their behavior and attitudes. These military colonies often became hotbeds of violence and instability because they were populated by men who had been conditioned to resolve conflicts through brute force and who had difficulty adapting to civil methods of dispute resolution. The influence of these veterans on broader Roman culture was profound. They brought military attitudes about hierarchy, discipline, and the use of violence to civilian contexts, influencing everything from child-rearing practices to legal procedures and social norms. The Roman concept of masculinity was profoundly shaped by military values because such a large proportion of Roman men underwent military conditioning. Traits such as aggression, dominance, and a willingness to use violence became not only accepted, but admired as essential masculine virtues. This militarization of civilian culture created a society where violence was seen as a normal and appropriate solution to a wide range of social problems. Disputes that other cultures might resolve through negotiation or mediation were often resolved through physical confrontation in Roman society. The impact on Roman women was particularly severe. They lived in a society dominated by men who had been conditioned to view violence as a primary tool of control and domination. Domestic violence was not only common, but legally protected as a man's right to discipline his family. Children growing up in this militarized culture were exposed to levels of violence and brutality that fundamentally shaped their psychological development. Many Roman upbringing practices were based on military principles of breaking individual will and fostering obedience through fear. The cycle perpetuated itself because children raised in this environment often developed the same psychological characteristics that made adults suitable for later military training. Roman society produced successive generations of individuals preconditioned to accept and participate in the brutal military system. Even Roman art and literature reflected this militarized mindset. Themes of conquest, domination, and glorious violence permeated Roman cultural expression in ways that reveal how deeply military values had penetrated every aspect of society. Roman architecture emphasized monuments to military victory, imposing structures designed to intimidate, and displays of power that communicated dominance through force. Even civilian buildings incorporated military design elements that consistently reinforced the primacy of military values in Roman society. Public spectacles, especially gladiatorial games, served as extensions of military conditioning for the civilian population. Roman citizens were regularly exposed to displays of extreme violence that normalized cruelty and created public demand for increasing levels of brutality in entertainment. These spectacles also served as outlets for veteran soldiers who needed outlets for their violent tendencies during peacetime. Participating as gladiators or working at the games gave former soldiers opportunities to exercise the violent skills they had been conditioned to value. The Roman economy became dependent on continuous military conquest not only to obtain slaves and resources, but also to provide suitable outlets for the violent energies of its army. Prolonged periods of peace created serious social problems because soldiers conditioned for constant violence became destructive when they had no external enemies to combat. This dependence on continuous military expansion eventually contributed to the collapse of the Roman Empire. The military system that had made Rome dominant also created internal needs that became impossible to satisfy. When territorial expansion reached its practical limits, the most tragic aspect of this entire system was that it destroyed not only Rome's enemies, but also the very soldiers who operated it. Men who entered the legions as normal individuals with normal capacities for love, compassion, and human connection emerged as psychologically damaged creatures who could never again experience full human relationships. The ultimate irony is that this brutal system was created by a society that considered itself highly civilized and culturally superior to the barbarians it conquered. The Romans genuinely believed they were bringing civilization and order to the world, without recognizing that their methods of doing so were fundamentally uncivilized. This moral blindness was possible because the Roman system created distinct categories of humanity. Roman citizens were considered fully human and deserving of moral consideration, while non-Romans were seen as essentially subhuman, and therefore worthy targets of any treatment that served Roman interests. Even within the ranks of Roman citizens, soldiers occupied an ambiguous position. They were honored as defenders of the state, but they were also recognized as fundamentally different from ordinary civilians. This difference was seen as a noble sacrifice they made for the common good, not as psychological harm inflicted upon them by society. The perpetuation of the system depended on maintaining this narrative of voluntary heroic sacrifice. If soldiers were seen as victims of a brutal process of psychological conditioning, it would be much more difficult to maintain the flow of volunteer recruits needed to sustain the legions. Therefore, Roman military propaganda consistently emphasized the glory, honor, and material rewards of military service, while downplaying or completely obscuring the real psychological and social costs. Young men were lured into military service by promises that bore little relation to the realities they would encounter. And now, as we come to the end of this in-depth exploration of life in the Roman legion, I hope you understand not only why you wouldn't last a day in this system, but also why no one should have to. What the Romans created was certainly effective militarily, but it was also one of the most sophisticated machines for destroying individual dignity and humanity the world has ever seen. When we look at our modern world, with all its flaws and problems, we must remember that we at least try to maintain some basic ideals about the value of individual human life and the limits of what a society can justifiably do with its members. These ideals were completely absent from the Roman military system, which viewed people literally as disposable equipment in the pursuit of imperial goals. The most important lesson we can take from this story is not admiration for Roman military prowess, but horror at the human price they paid for that prowess, and a determination that, no matter what challenges our own society faces, we must never be willing to pay that price again.